Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to third year English class. In today's lecture we will discuss about short story number 6, The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. That's a quite famous short story. Oscar Wilde is one of the most witty playwrights and short story writers of Anglo-Irish era. He was also a distinguished poet, novelist, and critic as well. He earned great reputation among the most eminent playwrights of the Victorian era. Oscar Wilde was a promoter of the aesthetic movement, which emphasized aesthetic values more than moral or social themes. The doctrine is most clearly summarized in the phrase, art for art's sake. The Happy Prince is also one of his most important works. So we have just learned about the writer. Let's discuss about the short story. We'll discuss the main points of the story so that you might be able to read this and go to the important points. The Happy Prince, high above the city, on a tall column, stood a statue of the Happy Prince. He was covered with thin leaves of fine gold. He had two bright sapphires in his eyes, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt. He was very much admired by everybody. There was a swallow who lived near a stream. His friends had gone away to Egypt 6 weeks before, but he had not, because he was in love with the most beautiful reed. So reed, students, is a kind of plant. The other swallows had told him that his love was ridiculous because the reed had no money and too many relations. And she was always flirting with the wind. After some days, Swallow also decided to go to Egypt. So he started his journey towards Egypt. One night, a swallow flies over the city on his way to Egypt. As he had been delayed after falling in love with a reed, attracted to her slender waist and gracefulness. When she could not accompany his travels, the swallow left alone. He ended up stopping under the statue of Happy Prince to rest. He rested at the pedestal between the legs of the prince. It was covered by thin leaves of fine gold. He had two sapphires in his eyes, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword. He saw the prince was shedding tears. Swallow asked the reason of his weeping. The prince told that when he was alive, he didn't know what tears were. He lived in a palace where sorrows and worldly problems were not allowed to another. He was totally cut off from the problems and difficulties of the common people. The people of his country used to call him the Happy Prince. And when he died, his statue was set up on high pedestal that he could see everything happening in the city. So, Happy Prince जब जिंदा था, उसको पता ही नहीं था कि आंसू क्या होते हैं. उसको मरने के बाद एक बहुत ऊंची जगह पे उसका स्टैचू लगाया गया. अब वहाँ से वो पूरे शहर को देख सकता था, ठीक है, और लोगों की हालत देख के इसी वजह से वो आंसू भी बहा सकता था. The Happy Prince asked the swallow to be his messenger. So, at first, the swallow was surprised to learn that statue is not made of solid gold, but he agrees to help the Happy Prince after he describes his pity for a seamstress. He agrees to become his messenger. Through a small window, the Happy Prince could see a very poor seamstress who was embroidering passion flowers on a satin gown. Her son was suffering from high fever. They had no food to eat, so the Happy Prince told the swallow to take out one ruby from his sword and give it to them. As she lives in a poor house and cannot care for her sick son, so the swallow agrees to deliver the ruby from the prince's sword hilt to her. On the way to deliver the ruby, the swallow sees old Jews bargaining with each other. He delivers the ruby and stays in order to cool the feverish boy by flapping his wings. After delivering the ruby, the swallow returns and describes feelings quite warm, in spite of the cold, due to his good deed. Next night, the happy prince saw a playwright in a cold garret trying to finish a play, but there was too cold that he was unable to finish the play. So the happy prince asked the swallow to take out a sapphire from his one eye and give it to him in order to buy wood for fire. So swallow also agrees to give the another ruby to young sapphire to young playwright to keep him away from freezing in the garret. The man needs to finish a play for the theatre director, but he has become too cold. He plucks out one sapphire from his eyes and gives it to him. The swallow returns once more to bid farewell to the happy prince, who pleads with him to deliver his another sapphire to a little match girl who has dropped her matches without any help. The child's father will beat her. She was crying because her father was going to beat her if she didn't bring home some money. In order to help the girl, the happy prince asked the swallow to pluck out the sapphire from his second eye to give it to her. As a result of this action, he became blind, and the swallow had to fly over the city in order to tell him what he had seen. He saw two children crying of hunger and a lot of poverty. So the happy prince decided to take out all the golden leaves to give them to the poor children. At last, the swallow knew that he was going to die because of intense cold weather, so he decided to stay with the happy prince forever. Swallow asked the prince to kiss on his lips, as he said he has done a good deed for him. The Sphinx, he tells of the red swallow sits on the prince's shoulder and recounts tales of Egypt and faraway lands. He tells of the red abysses on the Nile, the Sphinx who is as old as the world itself, and a great green snake who has 20 priests to feed it with honey cakes, though the prince calls these stories marvelous. He asks for tales of the suffering townspeople instead, as there is no mystery so a great as misery. The swallow flies over the city and reports of the rich making merry while beggars starve at their gates, including young boys trying to warm themselves under a bridge while a passing watchman tries to clear them out. After hearing these tales, the prince wishes to distribute the fine gold leaf gilding him to alleviate some of this plight of the people. The swallow agrees to help him and he delivers sheets of gold leaf to the children one by one. While the prince grows dull and grey, the children's faces grew rosier and they laughed and played games in the streets. Winter finally arrives and the swallow grows far too cold. Knowing that only limited time remains to him, he asks to kiss the prince's hands. Instead, the prince says, "You must kiss me on the lips, for I love you." The swallow does so and falls down at his feet. At that moment, a crack sounded inside the statue. It was the prince's leaden heart. Early the next morning, the mayor saw the statue. He said it was no more beautiful. He ordered to pull it down and melt it in a furnace. But the broken leaden heart did not melt. It was thrown away on a dust heap where the dead swallow was also lying. Moving on towards the story, we come to know about that God told one of his angels to bring him to the most precious things from the city. The angel took him the dead bird and the laden heart of prince. God said, "You have rightly chosen, for in my garden of paradise this little bird shall sing forever, and in my city of gold the happy prince shall praise me." So the students, here the story ends. It's a very interesting story. एक खुश खुरम शहज़ादे की कहानी है ये। इस कहानी में मुसन्निफ़ बयान करता है कि एक शहर में एक खुश खुरम शहज़ादा रहता था। इसकी मौत के बाद लोगों ने यादगार के तौर पर एक बुलंद सतून पर इसका मुजस्समा स्टैचू नस्ब कर दिया। शहज़ादे के इस मुजस्समे पर सोने की पत्तियाँ चढ़ी हुई थीं। اس کی تلوار کے دستے پر ایک روبی لگا ہوا تھا، اس کی آنکھوں میں قیمتی نیلم جڑے ہوئے تھے۔ ایک رات ایک ابابیل رات بسر کرنے کی خاطر خوش و خرم شہزادے کے پاؤں کے درمیان میں آ بیٹھا۔ اس پر پانی کے چند قطرے گرے تو اس نے اوپر دیکھا کہ شہزادے کا مجسمہ رو رہا تھا۔ ابابیل کے اصرار پہ شہزادے کے مجسمے نے اسے شہر کے لوگوں کی مصیبتوں اور غربت کو دے کر بتایا کہ کس وجہ سے وہ رو رہا تھا۔ شہزادے نے ابابیل سے مدد کی اپیل کی اور ابابیل اس کی مدد پہ راضی ہو جاتا ہے۔ فرسٹ آف آل دے ہیلپ سیمسٹرس ایز وی ہیو ریڈ ان دا اسٹوری۔ درزن کی مدد کرتے ہیں کیونکہ اس کا بچہ بیمار تھا، اس کے پاس علاج کروانے کے لیے پیسے نہیں ہوتے اور اس کا بیٹا اورنجز کھانے کی ضد کر رہا ہوتا ہے۔ سویلو کیریز آؤٹ ہز آرڈر۔ نیکسٹ ڈے اس کی آنکھ کا ایک سفائر اتار کے ایک پور ینگ مین کو دے آتا ہے، ٹھیک ہے۔ اس طرح ایک دوسرا سفائر ایک ماچس فروش بچی کو دے جاتا ہے اور ابابیل شہزادے کی نیکی سے متاثر ہو کے اس کے پاس رہ جاتا ہے اور اس کے جسم پر موجود 1 by 1 سونے کی پتیاں اتار کر شہر کے غریبوں کو، مصیبت زدہ لوگوں کو دے آتا ہے تاکہ ان کی ہیلپ ہو سکے۔ فائنلی جب مجسمہ بیکار بدصورت ہو جاتا ہے تو شہر کا میئر اسے پگھلا کر پھینکنے کا حکم دیتا ہے۔ ایک رات سردی سے ابابیل مر جاتا ہے، اس کے پاؤں میں گر جاتا ہے۔ اسی وقت اس کا جو دل ہے لیڈر، اس کے بھی 2 ٹکڑے ہو جاتے ہیں، تو اس کا مجسمہ اکھاڑ کے پھینک دیا جاتا ہے کوڑے کے ڈھیر پہ۔ اس کے دل جو ہے ٹوٹا ہوا تھا لیکن وہ پگھلایا نہیں جا سکتا، اس کو بھی کوڑے پر پھینک دیا جاتا ہے جہاں پہ ابابیل کی لاش پڑی ہوتی ہے۔ خدا کے نزدیک، اللہ کے نزدیک ابابیل کا مردہ جسم اور شہزادے کا ٹوٹا ہوا دل دنیا کے سب سے زیادہ قیمتی چیزیں ہوتی ہیں اور ان کو اپنے پاس بلا لیتے ہیں اور ہمیشہ کے لیے خوشیوں سے نواز دیتے ہیں۔ So the students, when we discuss the title of the story, that is quite ironical. The happy prince was the most unhappy and miserable, as he often wept over the miseries of his ex-subjects. He was in fact reaping what he had sown in his life. During his life, he remained quite aloof and detached from the problems of the people. He was called the happy prince by his courtiers, who were only the real cause of keeping him ignorant from the life of the countrymen. It was perhaps at the end of the story the prince became happy after atoning his sins by his sincere love and sacrifice for the humanity at large. The prince had become happy after achieving spiritual salvation through the realization of superficial worldly life, and after death by sympathizing with the poor and doing everything for their relief within his means. So Oscar Wilde was basically an Irish writer. In this story, he has presented the true picture of Victorian society. He threw light on the basic problems of Victorian age, such as poverty, hypocrisy, and exploitation. یعنی غربت، منافقت اور لوگوں کے حقوق کا استحصال جو کیا جاتا تھا، اس پہ اس نے روشنی ڈالی ہے۔ The central idea of this story is that love and sacrifice، محبت اور قربانی، are the most valuable things in the eyes of God. اللہ کی نظر میں سب سے زیادہ قیمتی چیزیں ہوتی ہیں۔ People should love one another and sacrifice their materialistic things for the benefit of others. لوگوں کو ایک دوسرے سے محبت کرنی چاہیے اور ایک دوسرے کو کی فلاح کے لیے اپنی جو مادی خواہشات ہیں ان کی قربانی دینی چاہیے۔ So this is the end of today's lecture. We will discuss questions in the next lecture inshallah. Stay tuned for more lectures. Take care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.